That night was supposed to be ordinary, nothing more than another quiet struggle in a life built on endurance. The black woman moved through her routine with the familiarity of someone who had learned to survive without expectations. Responsibility weighed heavily on her shoulders, yet she carried it with dignity, never asking the world for more than it was willing to give. She had learned early that attention often came at a cost. Keeping her head down was safer. Staying invisible was easier. Life had taught her to walk carefully, to exist within boundaries she did not create but had no choice except to respect. And so, when she entered the hotel that night, she did so with a single intention to pass through unnoticed. But fate rarely announces itself. A simple mistake, a distracted moment, a wrong turn toward the wrong elevator, and everything shifted. She stepped into a luxury floor that felt like another world, entirely silent, polished, untouched by hardship. The air itself felt expensive, unfamiliar, almost unwelcoming. The suite door before her stood open, glowing with wealth and secrecy. Instantly, she knew she did not belong there. Her heartbeat quickened with the instinct to leave, to correct the error and disappear back into her own reality. Yet, in that fleeting hesitation, destiny tightened its grip. She had already crossed an invisible line, one that separated ordinary lives from dangerous power. Inside that space existed a man whose life was ruled by control. The Korean Mafia boss was not a stranger to fear, yet fear never lived inside him. He was a man shaped by dominance, silence, and discipline. Emotions had long been sealed away, replaced by strategy and command. The world obeyed him not because he was loud, but because he was absolute. Their worlds were never meant to intersect. She carried quiet resilience, born from years of being overlooked. He carried authority forged in shadows. Her presence in that room was unintentional, yet it disrupted something deeply calculated. She was not defiant, not bold, not reckless, just human, standing in a place where humanity was often unwelcome. This was more than a wrong room. It was a collision of two lives defined by opposite truths. Her simplicity contrasted sharply with the luxury surrounding her. Her calm stood against the weight of power that filled the space. Without realizing it, she had stepped not only into a suite, but into the path of a man who controlled darkness with cold precision. That moment did not shout its importance. There was no chaos, no drama, only the quiet beginning of something irreversible. What seemed like a minor mistake was, in truth, the opening of a door that would never fully close again. A single wrong turn had placed her at the edge of a life-changing storm. From this point forward, nothing would remain untouched. Not her future. Not his control. And not the heart he believed no longer existence. He had built his life on distance. Distance from emotion, from weakness, from anything that could distract him from control. Power had shaped him carefully over the years, carving away softness until only precision remained. As a Korean Mafia boss, he ruled not through noise or chaos, but through quiet certainty. People feared him because he did not react the way ordinary men did. He watched. He calculated. He decided. The world obeyed because it sensed there was no room for mercy. Luxury surrounded him wherever he went, but it meant nothing to him. Expensive rooms, guarded hallways, and silent authority were simply the tools of survival. He trusted no one completely and needed nothing beyond loyalty and order. His past had taught him that affection was a liability, an attachment an invitation to loss, so he sealed his heart. For years, this distance protected him, kept him undefeated, untouched, and unchallenged. Emotions were reduced to weaknesses in others, never in himself. He believed he had mastered the art of ruling from the shadows, where nothing personal could threaten his empire. Then she entered that space without meaning to. Her presence disturbed something subtle but undeniable. Not through rebellion or confidence, but through contrast. She was not shaped by power, yet she carried something he had long forgotten, calm born from endurance. Her stillness did not challenge him directly, yet it unsettled him more than defiance ever could. He observed her the way he observed threats, carefully, quietly, without assumption. And yet, the more he studied her, the less she fit into any category he understood. She was not seeking advantage, not pleading, not performing. Her reaction to wealth, to authority, to him, was restrained dignity rather than fear or awe. That confused him. He had spent his life commanding obedience. Here stood someone who neither resisted nor surrendered, someone simply existing, grounded in her own reality. It forced him to acknowledge something uncomfortable. She was not impressed by power. This realization stirred something unfamiliar. His control had always depended on predictability, but she was unpredictable in the most human way. Her silence carried stories. Her eyes reflected experience rather than ambition. And without intending to, she created a quiet disruption within a man who had believed himself untouched by such things. It was not desire, it was awareness, an awareness that beneath her simplicity lay strength. Beneath his authority lay something unresolved. He was not drawn to her body or her appearance alone, but to the absence of fear in her presence. She stood where she did not belong, yet she did not collapse under the weight of it. That unsettled him more than enemies ever had. For the first time in years, his mind drifted away from strategy and toward possibility. Not because he wanted it to, but because something about her reminded him of the man he had been before power hardened him. A version of himself that believed connection could exist without cost. That version frightened him. Because if she could awaken it, then his control was not as absolute as he believed. And in that realization lay danger, not from the outside world, but from within. The man who ruled from the shadows began to feel the edges of his darkness soften. Not enough to change him yet, but enough to warn him. She was not supposed to matter. And yet, somehow, she already did. Silence has a way of revealing truths that words often hide. In that unexpected moment, silence stretched between them, heavy yet strangely calm. It was not the uncomfortable silence of fear or confrontation, but something deeper, something observant. Both became aware of each other without needing explanation, as though the space itself had paused to witness their presence. She felt it first at a shift in the air, a weight she could not name. She had entered a place far beyond her world, yet she did not feel small. Her instinct told her to retreat, but another quiet voice inside urged stillness. She stood with composed restraint, holding herself with dignity born from years of surviving without protection. He noticed that he had seen fear many times before: panic, desperation, submission, but her reaction was different. She was cautious, yes, but not fragile. Her stillness carried strength, and her composure unsettled him. It was as though she understood danger but refused to let it define her. He watched her closely, not with hunger, not with dominance, but with attention sharpened by curiosity. The kind of curiosity that is rarely triggered, especially in men accustomed to absolute control. Her presence felt accidental, yet not meaningless. Something about the way she held herself demanded respect rather than command. For her, awareness grew slowly. She sensed his authority without needing confirmation. Pressed quietly, like gravity, inescapable yet controlled. But beneath that weight, she felt something else. A restrained tension, an intensity held back by discipline. He was dangerous, she knew that instinctively, but he was also contained, as though every impulse was carefully measured. That contradiction lingered. Their eyes met briefly, and in that single moment, silence spoke louder than sound ever could. Carried questions neither of them voiced. Why did this moment feel important? Why did neither move away? Why did something as simple as shared awareness feel so charged? Neither understood the answer yet. For him, the silence disrupted patterns he relied on. Normally, he commanded movement, people reacted to him instantly. Yet here, nothing moved. No guards rushed in. No fear erupted. Just two people existing within the same quiet moment, bound not by force, but by shared presence. That disturbed him. He realized he was not in control of this moment, and that realization was rare. Even rarer was the calm it brought instead of irritation. The stillness did not threaten him. It grounded him. For her, the silence felt strangely safe. Not because the situation was harmless, but because it was honest. There was no deception in the air, no performance. Just awareness. She felt seen, not judged. Observed, not dismissed. And for someone used to being overlooked, that awareness struck deeply. This was not romance. It was recognition. Recognition that something unseen had passed between them. Something fragile but undeniable. A connection formed not through words or touch, but through the mutual decision not to break the moment. Silence ended eventually, as all moments must. But it left behind something irreversible, a quiet understanding that this encounter was not random, that whatever followed would not be simple nor forgettable. The silence had done its work. It had marked the beginning. By every rule he had lived by, her presence should have triggered consequence. His world did not allow mistakes. Accidents were treated as intentions, and intentions were dealt with firmly. Control depended on certainty, and certainty required order. Anyone who crossed into his space without permission was usually removed without hesitation. Yet this time, something interrupted that instinct. Curiosity stepped in where punishment should have followed. He did not see a threat standing before him. He saw an unanswered question. Her calm resistance to panic confused him more than any defiance ever could. She was aware of the danger, yet she did not crumble beneath it. That balance, fear tempered by dignity, held his attention in a way violence never did. He found himself studying her presence rather than eliminating it. This reaction unsettled him. He was not a man who hesitated without reason, and yet hesitation now felt deliberate. Her existence in that space had not disrupted his authority. It had challenged his assumptions. She was not there to take, to spy, or to manipulate. She was simply caught in a moment larger than herself. And he sensed the honesty in that. Instead of anger, he felt the pull of understanding. Instead of control, restraint. It was unfamiliar territory, one where instinct guided him toward observation rather than dominance. He allowed the moment to stretch, not because he had lost control, but because he wanted to understand why he still held it. For her, the absence of immediate consequence was disorienting. She had prepared herself for blame, for judgment, for removal. Life had taught her that mistakes were rarely forgiven, especially by powerful men. Yet what she encountered instead was quiet assessment. Not kindness exactly, but not cruelty either. That space between fear and safety confused her. She felt seen, not as an intruder, but as a person. That realization softened her tension without erasing it. She remained cautious, grounded in instinct, yet something in his restraint allowed her to breathe. This restraint spoke louder than threats ever could. For him, it revealed something hidden. He recognized a reflection of himself in her discipline. She did not plead, did not explain unnecessarily, did not dramatize her situation. She accepted the gravity of her mistake while maintaining self-respect. That mirrored the code he lived by more closely than he wanted to admit. Curiosity deepened. He began to wonder about her life beyond that accidental moment. What kind of experiences had shaped such composure? What hardships had taught her stillness? What strength allowed her to stand unguarded in a place ruled by fear? These questions followed him silently. What disturbed him most was not her presence, but the ease with which she occupied his attention. He was used to people demanding something from him: mercy, favor, protection. She demanded nothing, and in that absence, he felt the unfamiliar urge to give. This was not mercy. It was interest, measured, controlled, yet undeniable. By choosing curiosity over punishment, he crossed an invisible line within himself, a line he had sworn never to approach again. He allowed himself to consider possibility, to sit with uncertainty, to let a moment exist without domination. And in doing so, he unknowingly invited change. What began as an accident had become a turning point. Not because rules were broken, but because they were paused. In that pause, something fragile and dangerous took root, an interest that could not be forced back into silence. He had spared her without realizing what it would cost him. And she had survived the moment without knowing what it had begun. Beneath her quiet composure lived a history shaped by endurance. She carried pain the way some people carry faith, silently, without spectacle. Life had never paused for her struggles, and so she learned not to ask it to. Each hardship had taught her restraint, not bitterness. Each disappointment had strengthened her resolve to remain kind. Even when kindness was not returned, her dignity was not learned from comfort. It was born from necessity. From surviving moments where she was overlooked, undervalued, or dismissed without explanation. She had learned that survival did not always mean resistance. Sometimes it meant persistence. Standing tall without demanding recognition became her quiet rebellion. He sensed that depth instinctively. There was something in the way she held herself that suggested experience rather than innocence. She was not untouched by hardship. She was shaped by it. Her strength did not announce itself, yet it was unmistakable. This realization began to shift the way he perceived her presence. She was not fragile. She was careful. That distinction mattered to him more than he expected. In his world, people often displayed weakness to gain advantage or exaggerated strength to command attention. She did neither. Her authenticity unsettled him. It reminded him of a truth he had long ignored, that real strength often moves unnoticed. Her pain was not visible on the surface, but it existed in subtle ways. In the caution behind her calm. In the awareness that nothing was guaranteed. In the self-control that came from knowing how easily the ground beneath her could disappear. And yet, she did not harden. Despite everything, she retained gentleness. Not the naive kind, but the conscious choice to remain humane in a world that encouraged cruelty. That choice fascinated him. It challenged the foundation of the life he had built, a life where survival often required abandoning softness. He began to understand her without knowing her story. And that understanding drew him closer than curiosity ever could. For the first time in years, he felt the urge to protect without obligation. Not because she was weak, but because her strength deserved safety. This instinct confused him. Protection had always been a strategy for him, never an emotion. Now it felt personal. She, on the other hand, did not misinterpret his attention. She did not imagine rescue or transformation. Experience had taught her not to rely on hope shaped by power. What she felt instead was respect, rare, unfamiliar, but grounding. The absence of judgment created space where trust could quietly begin. Trust did not bloom suddenly. It arrived slowly, like a careful step forward after years of watching the ground. She allowed herself to believe that her presence was not a mistake, not an offense, not a burden. This belief, small as it was, changed the way she breathed, the way she stood, the way she existed in that moment. What neither of them realized yet was how deeply this exchange mattered. He was being drawn not to her beauty or vulnerability, but to her integrity. And she was responding not to his power, but to his restraint. In this exchange, something rare was forming: connection without demand, interest without possession. Her hidden pain softened his guarded heart, and his quiet recognition gave her a sense of worth she had never asked for, but deeply needed. This was the beginning of affection, not loud, not dramatic, but rooted in understanding. For years, his world had been built on control. Discipline, distance, and silence had protected him from weakness. Every decision he made was calculated, every emotion contained. He believed warmth was a liability, and attachment was a risk too costly to afford. This philosophy had kept him powerful, respected, and untouched, but also alone. Her presence disrupted that balance. Not loudly, not forcefully. It was subtle, almost unnoticeable at first. A quiet discomfort began to follow him, not of danger, but of awareness. He found himself thinking beyond strategy, beyond consequence. Thoughts of her surfaced uninvited, lingering longer than logic allowed. This unsettled him. He had always believed emotions were tools to be used by others, never by him. Yet now, something inside him resisted that belief. A sense of curiosity evolved into concern. Concern softened into attentiveness. Attentiveness slowly transformed into something he could no longer define. The walls he had reinforced for years did not. Compassion began to exist beside it, uncomfortable but undeniable. Her influence was not manipulation. It was contrast. She represented a life untouched by ambition for control, yet rich with moral strength. Where his world thrived on fear and authority, hers survived on patience and principle. This contrast forced him to reflect on what he had become and what he had sacrificed to reach that place. Memories he had buried resurfaced. Dreams abandoned long ago whispered quietly in the corners of his mind. A life where loyalty meant protection rather than command. Where strength meant responsibility rather than dominance. These thoughts had once been dismissed as weakness. Now they felt like truth postponed, not denied. He began to act differently without realizing it. His decisions grew slower, measured not only by outcome but by impact. Violence, once a reflex, became a last resort. Power, once displayed openly, was now controlled with intention. Those around him sensed the change, though none understood its source. She did not demand this transformation. She did not even know it was happening. That made it more powerful. Her existence alone challenged everything he believed about survival. She had endured without cruelty, suffered without corruption. She had survived life without surrendering her humanity. This realization unsettled him more than any enemy ever had. And in that unrest, something unfamiliar bloomed. Respect deepened into admiration. Admiration evolved into emotional gravity. He began to recognize her absence when she was not near. Silence felt heavier. Time felt slower. His world, once rigid and predictable, was shifting into something uncertain and alive. For the first time, he questioned whether his solitude was chosen or imposed. For the first time, he wondered if power without connection was truly strength. He did not yet call it love. But the cracks forming in his cold world were no longer reparable. Something warmer was seeping through, quiet, steady, irreversible, and with each passing moment, the distance between who he was and who he could become grew smaller. What had begun as a quiet disturbance evolved into something that could no longer be ignored. He noticed it in the smallest moments, how his focus drifted without intention, how decisions felt incomplete if they did not consider her well-being. The control he once held over his thoughts loosened, replaced by an awareness that followed him everywhere. This was no longer curiosity or concern. It was attachment, steady and undeniable. For the first time, absence carried weight. When she was not near, something essential felt missing, though he could not explain what. His world continued moving forward, obligations fulfilled, power maintained. Yet something intangible was absent from its core. Silence, once comforting, grew heavy with unspoken emotion. He resisted the truth at first. Acknowledging attachment meant admitting vulnerability, and vulnerability had always been a weakness in his world. Yet denial demanded more strength than acceptance. The more he resisted, the clearer it became his emotional distance was no longer protecting him. It was isolating him from something real. Her influence remained unforced. She did not seek attention, nor did she attempt to change him. Her presence was quiet, grounded, consistent. That consistency slowly dismantled his defenses. Where others feared him, she saw humanity. Where others expected cruelty, she showed understanding. This contrast reshaped how he viewed himself. He began to measure strength differently. Power alone no longer satisfied him. Control felt hollow without purpose. He started to recognize that real strength did not lie in domination, but in restraint. Not in fear, but in care. These realizations unsettled him, yet they also brought an unfamiliar calm. Emotion followed intention. His actions reflected concern long before he admitted it to himself. Protection came instinctively. Thoughtfulness replaced indifference. Even in moments of distance, his awareness remained anchored to her existence, as if her presence had become a silent constant in his life. Attachment transformed his solitude. Loneliness, once accepted as the cost of power, now felt unnecessary. He began to understand that his isolation had not been a requirement, it had been a choice made out of fear. Fear of loss, fear of weakness, fear of needing someone. She challenged that fear simply by existing. Her resilience mirrored his own, but without the darkness that had hardened him. She had endured without surrendering kindness, survived without sacrificing integrity. This realization deepened his attachment beyond attraction. It became respect woven with emotion. Gradually, his inner resistance faded. The line between protection and affection blurred. What he felt for her could no longer be categorized as responsibility or obligation. It had grown into something more profound, something rooted in connection rather than control. That he did not speak it, that he did not act recklessly. But inwardly, he accepted the truth he had long avoided. She mattered. Her presence had altered his world in ways power never had. And though uncertainty still lingered, One thing became clear: returning to the man he was before her was no longer possible. The attachment had taken root, and from that root, love was beginning to grow quietly, deeply, and with a strength that promised permanence rather than danger. Trust did not arrive suddenly. It developed slowly, built from moments that required no words and promises that were never spoken aloud. For someone who had lived behind walls of suspicion, trust felt unfamiliar and dangerous. His world had trained him to believe that closeness invited betrayal, that dependence weakened control. Yet with her, that belief began to soften. Not because she demanded trust, but because she earned it without effort. Her presence offered calm rather than expectation. She never pushed him to explain himself, never asked him to become someone else. Instead, she accepted the silence he carried and the weight behind his actions. That acceptance did something no loyalty oath ever had. It made honesty feel safe. He noticed how his defenses lowered naturally. There was no calculation involved. Around her, his vigilance eased. He no longer scanned every moment for threat or manipulation. The tension that usually lived in his chest quieted when she was near, as if his mind recognized her as sanctuary before his heart could admit it. Trust reshaped his instincts. Where once he anticipated betrayal, he now anticipated understanding. Where he used control to maintain distance, he began to rely on presence. This shift unsettled him, but it also brought clarity. He realized he trusted her not because she was harmless, but because she was genuine. Her strength deepened that trust. She carried her own scars with dignity, her survival shaped by resilience rather than bitterness. She did not view his power with awe or fear. She saw him as a man shaped by circumstance, not defined by it. That perception allowed him to lower the persona he had worn for years. For the first time, he felt seen without judgment. Trust became mutual. She sensed the change in him not through words, but through consistency. His actions grew careful, intentional, protective in a way that did not demand anything in return. She learned that beneath his restraint was consideration, and beneath his distance was loyalty. Fear slowly lost its authority. The fear that once governed his decisions no longer dominated his emotions. Though danger still existed in his world, it no longer defined his connection with her. Trust gave him the courage to believe that not all closeness ended in loss, that he allowed himself to depend just slightly. Not enough to surrender control, but enough to acknowledge that strength could coexist with vulnerability. This realization altered his understanding of power. Trust, he learned, did not weaken him. It grounded him. Love quietly deepened within that trust. Not dramatic or reckless, but steady and profound. It grew through shared understanding, through safety found in silence, through the certainty that neither needed to be guarded in each other's presence. Trust became the foundation, a foundation strong enough to support what was forming between them, strong enough to endure the risks of his world and the uncertainty of the future. And in that trust, something rare took shape, a connection built not on fear, but on mutual respect, emotional security, and a love that chose patience over impulse. Love, once gentle and steady, now stood against the reality he could no longer ignore. The world he belonged to was not built for softness. It demanded loyalty, secrecy, and sacrifice. Power came with a cost, and that cost had always been paid in solitude and distance. But now, love had entered that world quietly, firmly, and it refused to remain untouched by consequence. He felt the conflict grow within him. On one side was the life he had mastered, shaped by control and calculated decisions. On the other was the connection that had reshaped his heart, offering peace he never believed possible. The two could not exist without colliding, and that realization weighed heavily on him. Protection became his instinct, not as possession, but as responsibility. Her presence had become precious, and with that preciousness came fear, not fear of loss alone, but fear of what his world could do to someone unshielded by power. The danger surrounding him was no longer abstract. It felt personal now. He began to measure every choice carefully. Decisions that once affected only him now carried another life within them. His actions slowed, his risks calculated not for dominance but for preservation. Love had transformed his priorities without asking permission. Her influence was steady, not dramatic, She did not ask him to abandon his world, nor did she attempt to change it. Instead, she reminded him without words that goodness could exist even in dark places. Her presence challenged the belief that his life had to remain divided between power and humanity. The weight of his past pressed harder, memories of choices made without mercy surfaced, forcing him to confront the man he had been. Love demanded honesty, and honesty demanded reflection. For the first time, regret did not feel like weakness. It felt like growth. He began to consider a future. Not one ruled by fear or legacy, but one shaped by intention. The idea unsettled him. A future built on care rather than control felt uncertain, yet deeply desired. Love had quietly expanded his vision beyond survival. Commitment took root internally. Not through promises spoken aloud, but through resolve. A resolve to protect what mattered. A resolve to choose restraint over impulse. A resolve to ensure that love would not become collateral damage of his world. Love tested him and strengthened him. It did not ask him to become innocent, but it demanded accountability. It did not erase his past, but it pushed him to rise above it. The challenge was immense, but so was the clarity it brought. For the first time, he understood the true meaning of power. Power was not fear imposed on others. It was the discipline to guard what was fragile. The courage to change when staying the same was easier, and in that understanding, love did not weaken him. It prepared him for the hardest choice he had ever faced, choosing a future where his heart, not his darkness, led the way. The final choice did not arrive with noise or drama. It arrived quietly, shaped by reflection, restraint, and the clarity love had given him. For the first time in his life, he did not choose power out of habit or fear of losing control.
Et chose intention.
The world he had built no longer defined the limits of who he could become. Love had shifted his understanding of destiny from something inherited to something chosen. He accepted responsibility for his past. Not with denial, and not with excuses, but with resolve. What had been broken could not all be repaired, yet that truth no longer paralyzed him. Growth did not require erasing the past. It required refusing to repeat it. That realization anchored him. Change became deliberate. He reshaped his world from within, not through destruction, but through restraint. The influence he once used to dominate, he now used to stabilize. The fear that once maintained order was replaced with structure and discipline. Power no longer needed to be loud to be effective. Love remained his compass. Her presence reminded him of the man he was becoming rather than the one he had been. She never demanded transformation, yet she inspired it. Her strength affirmed that kindness was not fragile, it was enduring. Through her, he learned that goodness was not naive. It was brave. The future unfolded with purpose. Not perfect, not free of risk, but honest. He no longer chased distance as protection. He embraced connection as responsibility. Every step forward reflected the promise he carried within to guard what mattered, to stand between love and harm, to choose humanity over fear. Redemption was not a moment. It was a commitment renewed daily. A discipline of choosing patience over impulse, care over control, and growth over regret. He understood now that redemption was not granted. It was lived. Love completed the transformation. It did not soften him into weakness. It refined him into balance. Where darkness once shaped his identity, intention now led his path. His strength endured, but it no longer stood alone. What remained was a man changed not by force, but by connection. A future shaped not by the shadows of the past, but by the light he chose to protect. And in that future, love was not an escape. It was the foundation.